Hey, LinkedIn, and welcome back to Business Unusual. This is a live show where we're talking as a community about the changing nature of work. I'm your host, Caroline Fairchild, coming to you from my home office and my cell phone today, right here in New York City, editor at large here at LinkedIn. Thank you so much for joining us. National protests against police killings of Black Americans have now gone on for 8 straight days, prompting hundreds of business leaders to speak out strongly against racial justice in America. In the past, corporate executives may have shied away from making comments on events outside their immediate companies, but the devastating impact of the protests on the mental health of people of color across the American workplace is making it challenging for business leaders to not take a strong stance. The immediate impact of these public statements isn't really anything more than posts in social feeds expressing solidarity, but the long-term impact of leaders speaking out against what's happening right now in this country has the impact of really changing the conversation for diversity and inclusion across corporate America and race relations in America. On today's show, we'll speak with the heads of diversity for 2 blue chip companies, Boeing and Amazon, to get their take on how corporate response right now to these killings will impact diversity and inclusion efforts within corporate America moving forward. But before I bring on our guests from Boeing and Amazon, I want to hear from you. This is an event that is impacting us as a community. What are your insights? What's going on with your company right now? How is your manager speaking to you about the events that are going on in the country? Let us know in the comments, and we'll get to have a conversation about that on today's show. And with that, I want to bring on our guests for today's show. We have Sarah Bowen from Boeing, as well as Katrina Jones from Amazon Devices. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you, Caroline.
Yeah, thank you, Caroline. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, so Katrina, I want to just start with you. Can you take us back to when these protests first started? What were conversations like within Amazon in terms of what the response needed to be, and perhaps how it needed to be different than responses in the past to events that are happening right now?
Yeah, Caroline, we're responding in real time to what's going on. And so our conversations are as leaders, as people, we are also impacted. And first and foremost, thinking of our employees, particularly and specifically our Black employees, and how they're feeling the pain that they're experiencing in this moment, and really being empathetic to that, and considering how do we respond in a way that encourages people to show compassion to each other, that also acknowledges, again, the pain that Black employees and the Black community is feeling. And so, we are, like everyone, kind of absorbing everything, trying to take it in. And our promise is to support each other and to dig in this moment, to learn more, to educate ourselves, to stand up against and speak out against systemic racism and racial injustice, and then to consider what we will do differently right now and going forward.
And Sarah, I'll ask you the same question as well. What were conversations like when this began, and where are you right now in terms of communicating to employees during this difficult time?
Our response has been quite powerful. I've been amazed by both the way our leadership has leaned in, as well as how our own employees have stepped up with so much courage to share what they're feeling. I think first of all, our employees needed to hear from our leader, and our CEO came out with a very strong statement condemning racist acts external to Boeing, but also saying we're putting a stake in the ground as a company, and there will be absolutely no tolerance for any racist acts within our 4 walls. There has been so much courage by our employees. We've had people sharing their experiences, and the outpouring of support, the sharing of the suffering and the heartbreak has been immense, but also the sharing of our hope, the hope that we will pave a new path forward that is different from the path we've been on, and one for which we will never be able to go back to the way things were. So we're thinking about a lot of ways that we can provide immediate support to our employees and begin to shape the race conversation at Boeing in a very different and very meaningful way.
Katrina, I'd love to get your thoughts on what Sarah's saying in terms of changing the race conversation within
Yeah.
corporate America right now. Rhetoric is so important, and as you know, diversity and inclusion, these are terms that we've chosen to use instead of terms like anti-racism, which we're seeing so much in the news right now. Do you feel like the rhetoric around these issues is going to change moving forward, and if so, what does that look like?
I do, and it's one of the areas and that I'm really hopeful about in this moment, that we get more specific about what it means to increase representation, that we get more specific about the changes that we're seeking to drive versus, being very general in some of the language that we use. And I agree, language is critical. I think part of what's been missing when you look at diversity and inclusion has been that our language has been diluted, that we really haven't been clear about what is it that we're seeking to address in terms of inequities within our companies, within society. What is the change that we're seeking to drive? And now more than ever, we really need to be explicit and very specific about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and for whom we're doing it. And especially uh, being committed to centering certain groups, certain vulnerable and marginalized groups in the work that we do, and naming it loud and clear.
For those of you who are just joining the stream, this is Business Unusual, where we're having a conversation right now about how the police brutality that we're seeing in the country right now could have a long-term impact on diversity and inclusion efforts within corporate America. I want to say hello to some of the members in the stream right now: David from Pittsburgh, Liana from New York, Scott from Texas, Luis from Mexico City. Thank you so much for joining us on today's show. Sarah, I want to bring it to you and talk a little bit about how the language is changing. In Boeing, I'd love to hear how you are talking with, as Katrina was saying, the people of color within the organization who are really hurting and really naming the issues right now. What does that look like, and how is it different than, say, conversations that have been had in the past?
That question, important one. So I agree with Katrina. We have to name it. We have to be able to talk about it in a very direct way. One of the things that my team has been putting together and we're about to roll out is a guide to have a conversation about race and about racism in our country. What it means, in public spaces, what it means in an employment context, and what it means to the individual who is a person of color, who is African American, who wakes up every day having an experience that is different from someone who is not. And so this guide is intended for all managers across Boeing to use to have these meaningful conversations we haven't had before, or conversations that perhaps have been delegated to others to have. That time is over, right? We have a responsibility. We feel at Boeing that we all have a responsibility as leaders to lean into this conversation, right? There's no way around it. We've got to go through it. It may be uncomfortable, but this is a capability we have to learn because we are leaders, right? And we have to be there for our teams. We have to learn it ourselves. We have to figure out how to be stronger allies and advocates so that we don't keep walking the same path we've been on, so that we walk a new path. So we're rolling out this race conversation guide with an expectation that leaders have these conversations with their teams. We're rolling out an allyship infographic that includes everyday tactical things that people can do to shift the conversation. We're launching a pledge wall where people can go in and affirm their commitment to equality, to equity, to inclusion within our company. And we're hosting some conversations as well with senior executives at our company, as well as some of our business resource group leaders, to have these open and honest conversations and model it for the rest of us.
And picking up a little bit on active allyship, Katrina,
Yep.
unfortunately, a lot of white allies place the burden of education on how to be an ally on the people of color within their organization. And this is an issue that I've seen permeated across LinkedIn, where very well-intentioned allies might come to a person of color and say, how can I help? How do we make sure that this doesn't happen? Are there organizations or things that are going on within Amazon right now that are allowing people of color the space to mourn what's going on without feeling this additional burden of helping allies?
Yeah, and I want to call something out as we're talking because I notice we're framing some of our language in this conversation around people of color, and I want to acknowledge that it is specifically as we're talking about police brutality, as we're talking about the murder of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and so many others, that we are talking about the experiences of Black Americans and the treatment of Black Americans in the US. And so that's really important that we, again, when we say people of color, that experience is different when you're talking about African Americans. It is different when you're talking about Latinx people. It is also different when you're talking about Asian Americans. So I just want to make that point. Um, and Caroline, you asked a great question about allyship, um, and I specifically here within Amazon, we are um, making sure that we are providing spaces for Black employees to come together to talk about their experiences, creating that space for them to really come together in grief, but also in healing. Our affinity groups have taken the lead in holding those spaces and driving some of those conversations in collaboration with our diversity and inclusion teams. And it's been really fantastic to see the affinity group leaders to mobilize so quickly to make sure that we can hold these conversations. In fact, we had a courageous conversation maybe less than 2 weeks ago, and it was hosted and led by our Black Employee Network. And as part of that, we brought on therapists. So brought on some Black therapists to help process with attendees kind of what they were experiencing, what they were feeling. And that's critical, right? So there's that part, and there's also the piece of how do we help well-intentioned allies who are eager to figure out how they can contribute, how they can show up in solidarity, what they should do at this moment. And so, we've got some learning resources that are going out to people that are, built around and focused on education and also action. It really comes down to what can you do as an individual, right, within your teams, within the organizations that you work in, and also within your communities as well as in your home. And so lots of communications and lots of supporting resources that are out there for our employees who are looking to stand in solidarity. And that is inclusive of white allies and other non-Black allies who want to do the work.
Mm. Well, thank you for that perspective, Katrina. And also thank you for pushing me to be more specific with my rhetoric around the different communities that are being impacted right now. The whole point of this show is around the importance of rhetoric and diversity and inclusion. So thank you for calling that out. This is a specific issue to the Black community right now. Speaking of the specific issue, Sarah, prior to these events, diversity and inclusion within corporate America sometimes was siloed within certain organizations where there was this little thing that was going on over here, but the leadership and management team wasn't really thinking about it. Is this going to be the end of that? Are companies going to have to make sure across corporate America that D&I efforts, or what we choose to call them moving forward, are really embedded within organizations?
I hope so. I definitely hope so. I think, so many companies in recent weeks and months have come forward and said, and not only spoken out about this issue, but also have said, hey, the role of a corporation isn't just to drive profits and revenues. The role of a corporation is to engage and invest in our communities, to engage and support our environment, the health of our people, right? And I think there's a growing awareness that corporations are key stakeholders in our global economy, and none of us can succeed if we don't invest in our communities. And if there's, if the African American community is not supported, is not enjoying the equality that we espouse for all people, then we've got work to do and we can't be successful as a corporation. So I think we have hit a pivot point. The outpouring of support, solidarity, the call to action that we're seeing across the board from so many companies has been overwhelming. I think many of us, feel the sense of, we're putting our feet down, we are locking our arms, we are pivoting, and we are saying no to the path we've been on, and we are forging a new path ahead. I've seen it at the company where I am now. The leadership engagement, the hunger to do something different is really palpable. And I think once we start on this path and start to see how much healing there is, how much progress we can make, how much better we all become, right, when we're in it together, I think there will be no turning back.
And Katrina, what Sarah's really talking about is this massive response that we've seen from leaders across so many organizations, many of whom have not spoken out on race relations in America before. But of course, these are just now posts and social media feeds. There's still the work to be done. So what Sarah's calling kind of that first step, what happens next, particularly for these organizations where if you look at the leadership and management team, it is not representative of their customer base, of their employee base, of the stakeholders that they are building their businesses for?
Yeah, Caroline, that's such a great question. And that is the big question, is what happens next? And it's starting to bubble up for us. What are companies doing as an organization, at an organizational and institutional level, to create more equitable workplaces for Black employees, and for everyone? And so this, I think, is, to build on Sarah's point, it is a galvanizing moment, and we won't go back, right? Which is the encouraging part of this, is that now we can take the time and we have kind of that momentum to examine our talent management outcomes, for example, to say, is it equitable? Are the outcomes equitable across every different demographic within our organization? What does it look like across gender? What does it look like across race and ethnicity? What does it look like across ability? And what are the mechanisms that we need to implement to disrupt bias and to create fairer processes, talent processes, as well as entry points to our organization. And this is also a moment to shift culture, right? To look at our culture and look at the elements, the hallmarks of our culture, and examine, is this an environment where everyone, and I'm going to back that up and say, not just everyone, but the most marginalized, the most vulnerable, can not just survive, but thrive. So I think that that is some of the critical work that needs to happen within companies. I think there's also a call for companies to examine their practices, their business practices, and how they're developing products and services, some of the partnerships that they engage in. And some of that work is happening now. There's a movement, an initiative that was actually born this week, Black Tech for Black Lives, and I just want to call that out. Black Tech for Black Lives. If you go to the site, it actually has a 5-point plan that's focused on one, making systemic changes within our society around criminal justice reform, as well as making internal changes within tech companies.
Well, thank you for calling out that resource. And I want to read some comments from the stream of people who are very excited to join us in this conversation. Stacy says we need to talk about who runs these companies, which we were just talking about. Ashley says, I think this conversation is not as effective moving forward without ensuring that there are more Black management, Black executives supporting management teams. So Ashley, Stacy, thank you for joining us on Business Unusual. Sarah, picking up where Katrina dropped off in terms of ensuring that people of color, Black Americans in particular, which we're discussing right now, are not just surviving, but thriving within organizations. For the managers who are joining us on this stream, what does that look like? You can track how many people of color, how many Black Americans you're bringing into the pipeline, but how do you ensure that there are systems in place to make sure that they aren't marginalized and they are having an impact within these organizations?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, our strategy is founded on three platforms. First of all, there has to be inclusion for every single person. And there's a lot of work that we can do around that. Last year we had every vice president and their teams go through inclusion dialogues, talking about and understanding what it means to be included and what it means to be excluded. The work that we're doing now around race conversations is helping to build a sense of awareness, empathy, and inclusion. The second thing is about diversity, right? We have to actually look at and measure how we're doing. We've got to look at where people are getting stuck in the pipeline, people are leaving the pipeline. We've got to diagnose what those issues are and go in and design the solutions that address them. And then third of all is the equity in our systems and processes, right? That is not so much about a person or a team, but is about, as Katrina was talking about, our processes around talent management, right? The way we attract and select talent, the way we treat talent through development opportunities, promotion, and the efforts we take to retain talent. So all of those things, I think, are essential to an effective equity, diversity, and inclusion strategy. Those are the things that we're trying to further every single day to ensure that, as you look from, the factory floor all the way up to the most senior levels of our leadership, that you have representation of all races, of all forms of diversity in equal measure up that pipeline.
And I'm seeing some members in the stream agreeing with you, Sarah. Melvin says, time for talk is over. We must commit to taking action, and there has to be diversity in the group that will create the actionable next steps. And I want to make sure that we have time to take some questions from members in the stream. We have several. Katrina, I have one from Aiko that maybe you can take, where he's asking, what does accountability look like? Great with conversations and pledges, but what does accountability look like moving forward for these organizations as they take action?
Excellent question. Thank you for that, Aiko. Accountability is going to be critical here. It is not enough, and I think that is the wave that is coming is, you've had your statement. We've put out all of these statements, and so we need to back it up with action. And people are looking for that action, and what that looks like, and especially what it looks like within organizations is, having the data, being transparent with the data around your employee demographics, around your hiring, around promotion and advancement, around representation within leadership and management, and specifically people managers, and being clear about the plan and the strategy and the results in driving against that strategy. How are you changing and shifting the numbers within your company? And that's really a half of what accountability looks like. I think there's also a culture piece of, culturally, again, what is our culture like? What are the hallmarks of our culture? And what are the cultural barriers that may be keeping people out or preventing people from really being successful within our organizations? And dismantling those barriers is going to be the other half of that work.
And Sarah, dismantling those barriers gets to the pipeline and how we ensure that there are systems in place that make sure that Black Americans, Black workers are getting through that pipeline and having opportunities. You talked about monitoring that pipeline, but for the managers who are on the stream right now, what specifically needs to be tracked, managed, monitored in order to make sure that the pipelines are thriving, as we've been talking about, for marginalized groups?
Yeah, I think it's all those things that Katrina talked about. It's equipping managers with the information they need to do the right things, right? So one thing that we've been doing, I'm sure a lot of the companies represented on this chat have been doing is, when you go to hire, you put together a diverse slate, right? That's something every manager can do, every manager is empowered to do, and every manager should be held accountable to do. Similarly, the group of people you put together to make a selection about talent should also be diverse, right? No one of us has all the answers. No one of us can judge talent in a silo. We need a diverse group of people to help us make good, rigorous decisions. That's a low-hanging fruit kind of thing that all managers can do. Find accountability buddies, right, to help you be a stronger ally and advocate. How am I doing as an ally? What more should I be doing? These are things I think, in addition to the metrics, the analysis, the transparency, we've got to have some really practical and tactical things that every single person can do that will make a difference.
Well, Sarah and Katrina, I know I speak for the stream when I say thank you so much for joining us on Business Unusual. Eunice says this will take honest conversation and true communication by all. Racism is embedded in everything that we do. It won't be easy, but the talent and ability is huge and willing. Let's make it happen. Thank you for sharing how you're making it happen within Amazon and Boeing. I'm sure that everyone on the stream learned a lot from this conversation, and I look forward to hearing from you both soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
I want to say thank you to Katrina as well as Sarah for joining us for an open conversation around how the rhetoric of diversity and inclusion within corporate America needs to change to support Black Americans through this and the next chapter as we think about what happens moving forward and the path forward. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. This is Business Unusual, a live show where we're talking with you about the changing nature of work. We come to you daily from 12 Eastern from the LinkedIn news page. Tomorrow, my colleague Susie Jackson will be having conversations about jobs in America, so be sure to join us then. I'm Caroline Fairchild. Thank you so much.